So we don't have slides, so you can be happy about that. But I wanted to start off with just a quick quiz. How many of you know what open source program offices are? Excellent,
Very nice, very
excellent.
nice.
So we're speaking to a very educated audience, so I can just use OSPO, right? Don't need to explain it. And how many of you have been involved in open source for 10 years or more? Wow. Okay. So there's a well 20. Exactly. That's terrific. So we'll start out with introductions, and then we'll talk about our OSPOs and what OSPOs do, and then we really want to throw it out to all of you. We have a few questions but we want to throw it out to you. Remember, this is a career and entrepreneurship track, so we can talk about how to get into open source, careers in open source, or we can talk about building businesses in open source, or what OSPOs do, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the first time we've done quite like this,
Yeah.
this shape. So yeah, we're gonna riff with the audience. We strongly encourage you to ask questions. I think again, because it is that career development track, we want to spend some time actually talking to you and getting cogent answers about how you can develop your career. So this is Nithya. I think we've said that before. Nithya is the head of open source at Amazon. Pretty big deal. Nithya has also been working across the LF for several years. Currently, the board chair on the LF level, and director at large, right?
Director at large, and that's an important concept to explain. You know, most people think, especially at the LF, that it is a paid position or that you need to be a member to be a director. I'm a community member, so that's what at large means, that I don't represent my company. I represent all of you and the community.
Right.
Yes. And Stephen Augustus. What can I say about Stephen Augustus that nobody knows about? Stephen runs the OSPO at Cisco. And yes, and he has his own cheering
Go Cisco.
group. And then he wears a lot of volunteer hats, like a lot of us do, kind of governance hats and leadership hats. So he sits on the steering group for To-Do, for KubeCon, for Kubernetes, the technical steering committee. He's on OpenSSF governing board. So he's really involved in giving of his time and his governance abilities to all of these different communities. So you'll see a common pattern in our careers is we have a job that pays the bills, and then we also do a lot of volunteer work on the side to make sure open source is moving, in the right direction.
So yeah, I wanted to do, maybe we do fun facts too. I'll do a fun fact about myself, right? So when I'm not doing Kubernetes and insert all the other projects here, do enjoy a bit of karaoke. Also play on a pool team every Thursday. So that's my get out of the house night. Like, oh, go see people interact and stuff like that. Play on a pool team. I've been doing I don't know, 15 years maybe.
Pool night. That sounds awesome.
So
and
what about you?
It's called snooker or billiards or something, right? Snooker. Yeah. I'm not a very fun person.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that.
I'm a very serious person, but I love cooking. So, and especially over the pandemic, I opened up my mother's cookbook and started, recreating all the recipes. She had sent the cookbook to me when I was a student in college, and I had never really taken that seriously. But after she passed away, I said, I really want to honor her memory and recreate, some of her dishes, and also pass them on to my kids.
That's
heritage.
amazing.
Yeah.
And I think, there's that community element too of, so if you've ever had the opportunity to check out All Things Open, right? Nithya usually does a dinner during the conference, and we get together a bunch of open source leaders, and we just sit down and have a little nosh before the day gets started. So that's pretty cool.
It's so cool. It's my hometown now, Raleigh, North Carolina. So plug for All Things Open. It's a fantastic show. I love State of Open, by the way. This is my first State of Open, and it's a fantastic show. So I really enjoying it. I love the vegan lunch and bring your own bottle, lots of great principles. So open source program offices, it got started quite a few years ago, I think in the 2008 10s, by large companies like Google, Twitter, Facebook, etc. Because when you have thousands of developers inside your company using open source, you need someone who is kind of creating consistent practices, consistent licensing mechanisms, policies, guidelines. That's how these started, right? And when did Cisco's office start?
Interesting question. So we have had a few different open source efforts, and they've been in a few different areas of the company. The most recent one started again with me in 2021, and so like April will make my third year at Cisco. So previously VMware via Heptio and Red Hat via CoreOS. So that's been my past few years. But what I realized when and I got this feedback quite a few times from people where they're like, "Wow, we didn't realize Cisco was doing open source until you started." And that is an embarrassing sentence, right? From the sense of like Cisco's been doing open source for multiple decades, and there are people in various pockets of Cisco that have been doing open source for multiple decades as well, right? So really, this is I think to your point, having a consistency around like the systems in which we talk about open source work that is getting done is missing, right? So I look at this as a marketing and advocacy problem that we have, right? So even in our as we were prepping for this talk, we were just kind of like, I was like, hey, let me show you my OKRs. Like, this is what our team has been working on, and we've got angles of like both the internal and external advocacy, right? Because it's not enough. I think we have Cisconians who are on site here. We have Cisconians who have been on site in various conferences, and sometimes you bump into them in the hall, and you're like, whoa, you're here. Or whoa, we were sponsoring this event that I didn't realize we were sponsoring, right? And all of that speaks to like a communication framework that needs to be put in place, right? To better understand how we can advocate for the open source projects that we are either maintaining ourselves or supporting, right? So that's what I see OSPOs as, the kind of the nexus of how do we have that conversation across the org and how do we have that conversation externally.
And it's so important to cover both aspects, the internal aspect as well as the outside aspect. A lot of OSPOs also want to be outside showing support, but also to say that they are using open source, support open source, and to recruit open source developers, frankly. And at my previous company, where I ran the OSPO at Comcast, just like Stephen was saying, Comcast is even further removed from tech, right? It's considered Sky, it's part of Sky, or Sky is part of Comcast. And it's a media and entertainment company, and a lot of enterprises like banks and others are using open source. And setting up an OSPO for them really helps them message that they are software companies, they use open source, they are great places for people to work. Tech, it's easier to message it, but it's harder when you are not directly in tech. And that's why I think OSPOs become important. And frankly, these days, OSPOs are in universities, because universities have, the universities are calling them open technology offices or open offices, like RIT or University of California, Santa Cruz or Carnegie Mellon. And I don't know the OSPOs in the UK, but universities are finding that their charter is not just educating students, but it's also encouraging open collaboration, open science, open data, publishing research more openly, and that IP is not the only way to monetize what they do, that they can create a collaboration between universities and companies.
So I've usually been looking at OSPOs from the perspective of, at least in industry, right, where they sit. Right, because OSPOs are kind of chameleons, and depending on where you build them out, you have different outcomes, right? So like in Cisco in particular, we sit, so I report into the SVP of Outshift, which is Cisco's incubation, emerging tech and incubation arm. My boss reports into the chief strategy officer of Cisco, right? And that's a pretty unique shape, right?
It's a great place to sit.
And that's part of the reason I took the job, actually.
Yeah.
I was like, if you believe that open source is core to the strategy of how we do business, like, and that matters to me,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But then you've also got the OSPO that may be positioned near marketing, right? And you may see a dev advocacy, DevRel function emerge. You have the OSPOs that are positioned near engineering, and you see lots of open source engineers emerge from that. You've got OSPOs positioned near legal,
Yes.
right? And you get the compliance and risk management flow from that. So I think, just outside of the industry, it's been really cool to have all these conversations. And if you're in an OSPO, if you're doing OSPO work, you should be checking out To-Do Group. That's where we all sit around and we kind of have conversations like, hey, I was trying to do this thing and I have no idea how to actually do it. And you're like, cool, I also have no idea how to do this. Why don't we sit down and hack on something together, right? And we have these really great conversations that are also under Chatham House rule. So don't feel, I think there are lots of, depending on the industry, there are lots of people who cannot maybe they can't actually access the Slack channel, or they can't say something publicly, right? And you're like, it's cool. Cone of silence. Come on, come on down, hang out, and we'll have a chat about actually how to do this work. So the emergence of all of the OSPOs across not just the tech industry, but within universities, within these places that you don't normally see OSPOs, it's a great moment for open source.
It is a great moment, and to the point that you made, that's one of the reasons we use the word bridge in our abstract as well. And also, we want OSPOs to become the language by which organizations collaborate with each other. So, if you don't know who is running the OSPO at the European Union's commission, then it's hard to engage with that commission or know how to navigate it or what their policy or outlook on open source is. So a lot of governments are setting up OSPOs as well, and that's been huge because as you all heard in the keynotes and other places, open source was hiding under a rock for a very long time as far as the governments were concerned. And then in the last 5 years, we've kind of suddenly appeared on the regulatory and the policy work. And so having OSPOs in the United Nations, in the federal government in the US, UK, et cetera, is huge and is helpful to the back channel and the aspect of working together.
Yeah, it is kind of great to be able to just hey, Nithya, I was wondering about blah, right? Or
Yes.
all of a sudden, and as we start to build this connective tissue across the industry, being able to tap into what the strategy of another company is, just at the drop of a hat, right? I think with regards to the how we're having these conversations, how we're continuing to have these conversations. One of the ideas around OSPO, it's okay, we're accelerating developer benefits, it's doing compliance and risk management, but it comes down to sometimes if you're trying to sell it, it's the fear, love, and money, right? And the fear aspect has come up pretty recently, right? It's security, it's AI, it's all of these unknowns, right? And really opportunities for us to have deeper conversations about say the security stuff. It's now I get to do the I think we have a problem with telling people or helping people understand the value of open source, right? And literally every OSPO head that I've talked to has this issue of usually if you look at a standard business group we're very often considered, if you look at corporate IT, you look at some of the support functions, considered a cost center, right? But being able to flip that and actually have a reasonable conversation around what is the cost of doing this wrong? What is the cost of the SolarWinds? What is the cost of the Log4j? And that becomes a more captivating conversation for the business. I'm not going to show you how much money we're going to make over maintaining this open source project quarter over quarter, right? But I can show you what a potential vulnerability because we were not supporting an open source project looks like.
It is powerful,
Yeah.
and you have to speak the language of business, and that's another bridge building activity that OSPOs engage in. You're really translating from open source language to business language, because the business, you need to justify the cost of something, right? Whether hiring a maintainer or investing in upstream development where you're setting aside resources for doing upstream maintenance, and that's a cost because they could be used towards customers or towards the business, or you're investing in an OSPO and funding, so many people. To your point, it's a cost center. So we really need to advocate what would the cost be to the business if an OSPO didn't exist or open source didn't exist. And lately there have been some fantastic papers on the value of open source. I think there was one that came out of Harvard Business from
Nagel, I think,
yeah,
and
from Nagel,
a few
Frank
other
Nagel,
folks.
on the value of business, and he talks about, I think, something like $3 billion or $4 billion of the supply side, but the demand for open source is in the trillions, and across all of our companies and governments, etc. So it's where you live in the company is so important. So strategy is a good place. Engineering often is another good place, especially if it's CTO. And then articulating the value of the business value of open source is important, and having a really good reputation relationship with the outside community is important.
Yeah, so I mean, I have, I wear a few different hats. I'm kind of contributor, and when I propose open source to people, I kind of like look at from the lens of the contributor, the maintainer, and then the sponsor, right? And I happen to wear all three hats. So depending on the day, it's doing a different deal, right? One of the responsibilities I think we have to again, back to that messaging component and some of the stuff that we were talking about on stage with the internal forces, I was talking about like a social contract. Like, what is the contract that we expect to have with individuals that may be consuming our project or want to contribute to the project or want to sponsor the project, right? And open source maintainers are really bad at communicating the value of their projects, or the conversations I've had of like, tell me, if you've ever been to a conference and you kind of click through the website, eventually you might get to the letter that says like, this is the how to convince my boss to let me go to this conference. If you're an open source maintainer, like strongly consider why should you contribute to this project? What is the value to some business out of contributing to this project, right? Because if I see that, I can very easily go, boom, here it is. I had to do no work whatsoever. Like when we're justifying a long-term maintainership or long-term support of some project, it's right there, right? So being able to like communicate not just your value, but the value of the project, and like make it easier for us to support you, right?
Yeah.
I think is so. I think we're also it behooves us to help them build systems to do that, right?
I don't know if this is what you meant, but there are a lot of processes that are very mature in companies, whether it's a product management, writing requirements and working with developers on those requirements, and project management, etc. All of these, and HR, and they're all missing, right, in open source communities. And so volunteers like us from corporate can also bring some best practices and some level of process and discipline, and contribute some of that to open source. So we are sitting at 1:20. We have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe we walk around and.
Yeah. Any questions, and we can come to you with a mic and yeah.
Don't be shy.
Hi. I was curious to learn what values have you used and been successful with when advocating for open source internally in your company. When you talk about translating open source to business language, how do you convince a VP level we should keep contributing to this when you don't have the return on investment model that is so successful in business? It's actually very hard to apply to open source. So what values or what components do you speak to when you need to advocate and you've been successful with?
Yeah. So I think as we're going into like the fear, love, and money components, the security conversation is amazing for this, actually, especially as people are kind of digging into like they're talking about S-bombs, and we got a great song earlier today, but like we've got being able to trace the dependencies down of what you're consuming, right, and the value of what would happen if that was to go away, right? What's the cost of sending this project $1,000, right, versus staffing full-time engineers to do this, right? And I can go. Eventually, I have to talk to a person, and eventually, like they will show up with a spreadsheet where I can, people, the higher up you go, people are numbers somewhere on a spreadsheet, and I'm like, this is the cost of FTE for you, right? And to staff this project over time, it's 10 FTEs. Do you want to do that, or do you want to send them 5K? Right. And then like that is powerful, right? And like, or do you want to deal with a security vulnerability? Do you want to spin up a PCERT team? Do you want to handle vulnerability management for this project that you don't know that much about, right? So it's not just domain; it's also contractual, right?
I think security is a powerful motivator for sure. There are two other motivators. One is regulatory motivation. So with a lot of the policies coming out, the SBOM and executive orders in the US and CRA, it is a forcing function also to, because it holds the integrator and the commercial producer of the product as responsible for open source that they are supplying. So it really is a powerful motivator for companies to invest in making sure they are complying. The third area that I would say is we are trying to also help teams measure business risk, business continuity risk. What I mean is if you have taken a dependency on this very, very large open source project, you need to understand and be present in the project in order to see if it will continue, is it sustainable, is there a risk of license change, is there a risk of support going away for the project, and you need to invest in mitigating those risks because this is a huge dependency for your business. So, and the business understands that language, and then they can then justify investing in resources to mitigate those risks.
I think just the same with the kind of the value capture. If you are maintaining an open source project or contributing to one, like how do I, there's the open source sunshines and rainbows and unicorns and all that fun stuff, and then there's a sense of the corporate altruism, right? And there's no such thing, right?
There is no such thing.
There's
as
no such
corporate
thing,
altruism.
right? So
Yeah.
so being able to say as well, we contribute to this project because it happens to be in our domain of concern, but also we've got this company, this company, this company, this company, right? And if you go back to that, what is the cost of doing business, FTE cost, et cetera, over time, being able to defray that across companies, right? As like corporate, corporate goblin as that sounds, like that is an aspect of that plays into it.
I think our good friend Denise Cooper used to call it enlightened self-interest. So anyways, any other questions?
Hello, I've got a question about how do you balance the tension between satisfying the needs of the compliance areas? I mean, I work for a bank, for a Swiss bank, so there's always the kind of compliance and the external regulation. And also, in an OSPO, how do you enable and provide that engineering enablement? And there seems to be a bit of a tension that the OSPO has to manage there. Like you want to make the environment open to engineers, and you want to encourage that contribution and consumption in the same way, in a safe way, but at the same time, you're trying to also do reviews, which can be seen as closing a lot of that stuff down.
So yeah, so I feel that there's we go into we can go into like the security and convenience. There's an inverse relationship between the two, right? So the more secure something is, the less convenient it might be, right? It's when two-factor is just rolling out, or we were still doing the chip keys and in the laptops and RSA tokens, et cetera, right? That was friction bound, especially if, say, you're a remote employee, right, and you can't get access to those things, right? Separately, if you look at, I think trying to, we're meant to be these stewards for the situation. I think we also talk a lot about, and it's going to come out of my mouth, and I hate saying it, but like shift left. Right. When we shift left, everyone's like, let's shift left on something, right? And eventually, and then we've got the dev and the ops and the DevSecOps and the ML ops and the et cetera, and we're just going to stick more things on ops. And the further you shift left, right, you're eschewing responsibilities for this thing, right? You have to decide what you want to be responsible for. You have to decide what is convenient, what is painful, what is not secure, what is not cost efficient, right? We were talking about AI right now, and AI, and you were like, hey, it'd be really cool if we built a model. It's like, yes, but then you have to either choose that you're going to build that stuff on site, right, and own the cost of that in your data centers, or you might want to do it in the cloud, and then you have to own the cost of paying the cloud bill, right? So like you need to set up like what are your constraints for even getting into the situation. How do I feel about, is this too much money? Is this not secure enough, right? And the same is true for open source, right? How much of it can I consume without still feeling safe about being able to deliver a product on time? I remember when we had, so for anyone who uses Kubernetes, I manage the team that releases Kubernetes quarter over quarter, or every 4 months. When we changed the release cycle, I got like, not death threats, but like hate mail. Definitely hate mail from people about like, hey, you're affecting my product development life cycle, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, great. I don't care, right? Like part of the reason that we moved the cycle was because we were kind of like during the pandemic and like everyone was burnt out, right? Like we need to create more time in the system. We need to create something that we can actually support, right? If you would like to be a part of that conversation, Kubernetes has great contribution docs. Come on down. If you want your opinion to count, do it in the community, but don't send me mail about it, right? So I think there's an element to like being part of that life cycle. How much of that can you, like, do you want to roll your own so that you can control each part of that, each part of that conversation? Or do you want to put some of that responsibility on a community? You have to make that decision, right?
I'll give you a simpler answer in the sense that
I'm a very complex man.
It's exactly a lot of great stories. It's about risk at the end of the day, and you've got to say what risks are simple and okay to take, and so we have to reduce the friction in that process, and what risks are high, where we put more friction in the process. And so the approach we've taken is to have high friction for high risk issues, and then automate, simplify, or self-authorize contributions, releases, et cetera, so that they don't have to go through, and we are encouraging good behavior there, right, contributing back and things like that. So I don't know if that's the approach you all are taking, but it takes a little bit of time to kind of step back and say, what are the things that are not one-way doors where we will regret approving this, and just making it as easy as possible. I know we are sitting at 1:29.
Should we try to squeeze one in?
Time for one more question? Yeah.
I was just curious if you tried mapping dependencies of open source projects internally in your company, if you did it company-wide or if you did it product-based. Because we were talking about dependencies, so yeah.
Yeah, so yes, and maybe sort of. It depends. You know, the sufficiently difficult question by a senior engineer is answered with, it depends. So I think depending on the size of the company, right? If we're looking at the size of an Amazon, the size of a Cisco, it's a little hard to do just in totality, right? I think what's important to me is kind of engendering these OSPO and open source champions across the org, where you can give them the tools to make those decisions for themselves, right? My team primarily works in Go. We had a conversation with the team that primarily works in Ruby, and they were like, "Hey, we want to talk about Ruby." And I was like, "Oh, I didn't even know you worked on Ruby. That's really cool," you know. But so like it's gonna be a little different for every group. I think what's important is that we provide a framework to operate in. So if it is that tool that we're going to help you trace your dependency stack, and maybe that will help with funding decisions, right? But it is, at least for us, it's going to be group to group as opposed to in totality, right? We provide the framework, you provide the context.
Agree. Every business in our company, it ranges all the way from devices to stores to video to AWS, and everyone has a different workflow, a different system that they use, and so we want to empower teams to do it themselves and make sure that we have to, right? All of us have to, from an SBOM perspective, but also from a risk management perspective. So we are having them, providing a framework for them to do it themselves. Thank you so much.
Thank
you
you,
guys
thank
were
you.
a fantastic audience.